Oh, Amicus, I don't need an abacus to count your greatest hits, to count your greatest hits. Hi guys, so throughout this year I have been reviewing loads of Amicus movies, and you'll find all those reviews in my Amicus playlist. Now this studio did 31 movies in total. I've only seen 20 of them, and I'll be including all 20 in today's ranking. The other 11 films are just things that I'm not interested in, comedies, experimental dramas. Amicus covered a lot of different genres, but I've only watched and reviewed the films that I was genuinely interested in seeing, and that number just so happens to have reached exactly 20. I still think, though, that this is the biggest Amicus ranking you will find on YouTube, because I did a quick search and all I could find from other people were reviews of just the Amicus anthology films. Now I'm sure one day somebody will come along and do a ranking of all 31 Amicus films, and that would be awesome if it happened, and I'd love to see that video. But for now I maintain that this is the biggest Amicus ranking you'll find on this platform. So let's get into it, shall we? Obviously we'll be taking these from worst to best, so let's find out what I consider to be the worst Amicus film I've ever seen. So at number 20 we have The Terranauts. It was a very easy choice to put this one last. I really struggled with this one. It's basically like Button Moon meets a really bad Planet of the Apes sequel with a sprinkling of Demon Seed. But it feels dated even for the end of the 60s. This feels like more of a mid-50s sort of sci-fi production. It's very cheaply made, paper-thin characters. I can barely remember the plot. I think some people get trapped on like a Blue Peter-esque spaceship. They end up at a distant planet and then they come back again in time for the end. It's only about an hour long and it still felt like a hell of a slog for me. I get that I'm watching this film through a 2024 lens. Maybe it would have been better for me if I was a 1960s kid watching this on TV, but unless you are an absolute devoted sci-fi boffin who enjoys old school films like this, then I just don't think you're going to get much out of it. But I hope I haven't offended any genuine fans of this movie. It just wasn't for me. At number 19 we have The Beast Must Die. This was definitely the biggest letdown of my Amicus adventure. At least with The Terranauts I wasn't expecting anything. With this I was genuinely looking forward to it. I mean, a werewolf film in a mansion with Peter Cushing in it. I mean, it was guaranteed to be good, right? Well, as it turns out, no. For a start, there's way too little time spent in the actual mansion. We're mostly outdoors following the owner of it, who is going around like setting cameras and traps, and occasionally he'll get into a jeep chase with somebody who has escaped the mansion. But it's just so tedious that the scenes where Anton Differing is sat in his control room and he's giving out instructions to his boss as to where to step in the woods, and those scenes just go on forever. The werewolf itself looks terrible, and the whole thing is just a weird fusion of like genuine werewolf horror and blaxploitation action, and it does not work at all. You get the occasional nice scene involving Cushing or Charles Gray, but for the most part, I did not get on with this movie. And to make matters worse, I spent about £12 or £13 on the Blu-ray. This is the risk you take when you buy physical media, when you've not even seen the movie yet, but it's all part of the game, and sometimes those little gambles just don't quite pay off. At number 18, we have At the Earth's Core. This is another Peter Cushing one. So this is one of 3 fantasy films that Amicus did. So this time Cushing is teaming up with Doug McClure. They use a drilling machine to go down to the centre of the Earth, where they find a living, breathing world full of dinosaurs and mind-controlling lizards and Caroline Munro, improbably. Now, I'm not going to say anything about the production design in this film. At the end of the day, they had the money that they had, fair enough, but there are other things that they could control a lot better, like story and characters, and there's just not a lot there in this movie. This is a film definitely lacking in charm, and I would look for something like that in a movie as old as this, and it's just not there. I watched this film with one eye open and the other eye firmly fast asleep. You can get a little bit of enjoyment because of Monroe's presence. And also there's one great scene, to be fair, where a giant plant creature is attacking these two guys in a cave. But for the most part, it's not a great experience, this one. At the Earth's core, more like at the Earth's bore. That sentence makes no sense, does it? At number 17, we have They Came From Beyond Space. Now, when it comes to this movie and the Terranauts, I think what happened is, at the end of the 60s, Amicus decided to make a sci-fi movie, so they got the budget together to make a movie, but then they changed their minds and decided to make two sci-fi movies, but with the same budget, and that's why the Terranauts look so cheap and why this film looks so cheap. I think that's how it all went down. I read this book last Christmas called Amicus Anthology, although it's a bit of a misleading title because it's not just about the Amicus anthologies, it's about all the Amicus films. So the book is kind of selling itself short there by writing the word anthology on the book cover, but never mind. But yeah, I'm sure I read in this about the history of the Terranauts and They Came From Beyond Space, although don't quote me on it. But I do remember that this film is a lot more watchable than the Terranauts. So some aliens come down, they start taking over human bodies, a bit like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They all blockade themselves into this place, and then they start building like a spaceship or a rocket, and there's a bloke trying to get in and find out what they're up to. But I've forgotten most of this film already, even though I only watched it a few months ago. But I definitely remember enjoying it way more than the Terranauts, so I'll go on record as having said that at least. At number 16, we have The Land That Time Forgot. So here we have Doug McClure and friends stumbling across a random continent in the middle of the sea. It's full of dinosaurs and cavemen, even though this is like the middle of World War II, go figure. Now, there's a really good adventure feel to this, and this is definitely a more expensive film than At the Earth's Core, I would say. I enjoyed the bromance between Doug McClure and the German submarine captain. I think there's some good character work done in this film for the most part. And also, the ending of the film is quite clever. It completely subverts expectations. I thought I had guessed how this film was going to end from a very early stage, and I was totally wrong. But on the downside, there's a really boring subplot about the hunt for petrol to resupply the submarine, and anything to do with the tribes people in this film is kind of boring. I much preferred all the action with the dinosaurs, even when the dinosaurs didn't look that great. And there's a weird thing about the island's water, and somebody at some point gives an explanation for that, but it's all very dull. So there's pros and cons to this movie, although overall I'll just about give it a thumbs up. I did kind of enjoy it for the most part. At number 15, we have I, Monster. This is basically a poor man's Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, if you've ever seen that particular Hammer movie. You know what, though? Out of all of the films that I'm talking about today, this is the one that has gone out of my memory the most. Like, every time I try and picture what happens in I, Monster, I just keep getting images in my head of Ralph Bates and Martine Beswick, but these are actors from the other film, the better one. So when it comes to I, Monster, I can only really direct you towards my full review of the film, back when it was all really fresh in my mind, because I'm just drawing a complete blank today. Although, instinctively, I still think I would rather rewatch this one than all the films that have come below it in the ranking, but that's honestly the only compliment that I can give it today. At number 14, we have Scream and Scream Again. So this is a bit of a mess of a movie. We've got Vincent Price playing a scientist, Peter Cushing operating in some kind of fictionalised version of Nazi Germany. There's a plot to take over key government figures around Europe, maybe. And in the middle of it all, we've got like car chases, foot chases through quarries, people dying in acid baths, a weird sci-fi version of date rape, all sorts of random stuff happens in this. I actually remember a lot about what happens in this movie, just not necessarily why it's happening. It's all very convoluted. I definitely think a second watch of this film would be a good thing for me. I can still remember the theme tune very well. Like, even now, months after watching the movie, I could sing you the chorus for Scream and Scream Again. I'm not going to, though. one, because of potential copyright strikes, and two, I've already tried singing in this video and it didn't go down so well. Despite the fact that I'm a little bit unsure about this movie, I wouldn't try and dissuade you from watching it. It's definitely original and certainly very interesting. I'm just not sure that the plot all fits together in a very satisfying way. I'm sure I was more decisive and clinical when I did my actual review, but that all seems a very long time ago now already. At number 13, we have The Psychopath. So this is like a police procedural horror film, but in black and white. We follow this cop as he tries to get to the bottom of who the psychopath is. And I think the film wants you to think that the killer is this mummy's boy who lives in this house full of dolls, and his mum is like Miss Havisham from Great Expectations, except it's not the mummy's boy, it's somebody else, and I've actually forgotten who. I do remember this woman in this film who is an absolutely stunning blonde, and I also remember the finale, which takes place in a boatyard. There's this really funny kill where some giant linking chains just fall down onto this killer, but they wrap themselves around him like really perfectly, as if it's an anaconda with an actual brain. It doesn't make any sense, but it did give me a chuckle. I'd go back and watch this film potentially. I think I had to buy this in order to watch it. I think I've got a copy of it in my cupboard somewhere. Although whether I actually will ever revisit it, highly debatable, I'd say. At number 12, we have The People That Time Forgot. So this is very clear in my memory because this was the last Amicus film that I reviewed before coming to this ranking. In fact, you'll find that review just 2 videos further down from this one. So this is a sequel to The Land That Time Forgot. It's also my favourite of the 3 Amicus fantasy films, and I think the biggest reason for that is that this has the most simple, straightforward plot. A bunch of people land on the same continent from the first movie. They head off in a straight line to find Doug McClure, having a bunch of adventures and near-death experiences on the way, and then they turn for home and head back, having a bunch more adventures on their way back to the plane. The dinosaurs in this film definitely look slightly better than they did in the first movie. The characters, whilst being slightly irksome to begin with, end up becoming quite likeable, I found, and the 2 leads, Patrick Wayne and Sarah Douglas, do fairly well here. And I think the thing I loved most about this is that you never know what danger is coming around the corner in this movie. This is more what I would hope to find in an old school 70s fantasy film, although I'd still not call it one of my favourites from the genre, but it's still a lot of fun old bean. At number 11, we have And Now the Screaming Starts. So this is a supernatural horror film that takes place in a countryside mansion. A woman who is newly engaged to the owner of the house, she thinks she's seeing things all over the place, and she is actually, but the trouble is nobody believes her. Even when various staff members start dying, her husband just thinks she's crazy, which is probably one of the most annoying elements to this movie. There's lots of decent horror here. There's a spooky, overgrown graveyard. There's a disembodied ghost hand moving around at points. But all the stuff to do with the characters and the character arcs is just really handled very, very shoddily. Like, this film has been written in a really naive way, as if the only thing that matters is having a few scares here and there and a few deaths and what have you. But it's also about the story and characters, and this film falls flat in that area, which is a real shame because the mansion itself looks terrific. I think the actors are very... Peter Cushing shows up in this. I'd completely forgotten that. He shows up halfway through this, and he puts in a pretty good term, but he can't quite rescue a movie that is on the very cusp of being really good, but just can't quite manage it. At number 10, we have Torture Garden. So if you know your Amicus, then you might be thinking at this juncture, oh my god, he's only just got to the first anthology film, and there's like 7 of them. Well, yes, it's true that our top 10 today is chock-a-block of anthology films, but, you know, they are the crown jewels of the Amicus kingdom, so we shouldn't be too surprised. But for me, this is absolutely the worst of the bunch, and that's despite the fact that the wraparound story is excellent. I love this character that Burgess Meredith is playing. He owns this little sideshow at a fairground, and he's asking all of his customers to pay £5 extra to come and look at something extra cool in the back room. But the problems of this film are with the main stories that we eventually get to. There's only really one excellent one, which is the man who collected Poe, Peter Cushing and Jack Palance trying to out-act each other at every turn. Most of it takes place in a creepy basement, and it's just really good. But the other stories are either underdeveloped or just mediocre, and the example that springs immediately to mind is the one with the grand piano where it backs a woman into a corner. I think this would work really well as a written story, but on the screen, when you can see the actual images, it's just cheesy rather than scary. And the other 2 stories I've not mentioned, they're not that much better, really. So I didn't even hesitate when it came to placing this in the lowest spot for an anthology film in this ranking. And they even got the title wrong. I mean, don't call it Torture Garden, call it Fairground Garden. I mean, Torture Fairground, that's what I meant to say. Call it that. At number 9, we have The Deadly Bees. So this has probably got my favourite Blu-ray menu out of my entire collection, and I've probably got like 500 or 600 Blu-rays at this point. So the menu has got this really vibrant, mostly yellow colour scheme, and there's some cool pop music playing over the top of it. And after I'd watched this film, I just left the menu running in the background while I surfed my phone for like 20 minutes. But you're always going to get some good music in this film because the main character is a pop star, but she's recovering from depression or something, I forget now. But in order to get over her problems, she decides not to go and live it up somewhere like Vegas or Miami. She goes to an Isle of Man type place and lives on a bee farm for like a few weeks. Each to their own, I suppose, though some people will say she absolutely deserves it when the bees get loose and start killing people. There are some really cheesy effects in the movie, but I'd expect that. And actually, I think it just adds to the charm of this whole thing that you've got people going when there's no bees in the room because the effects have not been added yet. But there's a nice mystery at the heart of this. You don't know who it is who's letting the bees out constantly. You find out near the end, but I actually guessed it wrong in terms of who the culprit is here. So good mystery, a good fun film packed with kills here and there, nice main character, good music. So it was a better film than I thought I was going to get, and I could actually see myself chucking this one on again at some point in the future. I've got the Blu-ray for this because I bought it when I reviewed the film. I might put it back on just for the menu. I might just shove the Blu-ray in, watch the menu for 10 minutes, and then pack it away again. At number 8, we have The Skull. This is one of the earliest films I covered for this series. So here, Peter Cushing is playing a collector of macabre artifacts, and he's got this greengrass type friend who helps him get stuff, albeit for ridiculous prices. And all is well until Cushing buys this skull, which used to belong to a murderer, I believe. But this thing, it brings bad luck, it makes people kill other people, and we get a variety of victims in this film, from Christopher Lee in his billiards room to a hotel owner and so on. And we follow Cushing's journey as he slowly realises what the problem is, but ultimately far too late. This film's got a very creepy atmosphere that I really liked, a very original story. There's a brilliant dream sequence where Cushing is just walking through this horrible corridor, and at the end of it is the skull just waiting for him. I liked this film a lot, and I would say that we are now into the really excellent films in this ranking. I don't think The Deadly Bees in 9th quite qualifies as excellent, but this one, The Skull, definitely does. So it's all Amicus brilliance from here on in. We're onto the really top tier shelf now. At number 7, we have Vault of Horror. Now, this one would be even higher, but for the fact that the wraparound story is easily the worst in the series for me. It's just a bunch of guys getting off on the wrong floor of a building. They end up in the basement and they start telling each other the stories that we're about to watch, and in the final reel they all realise that they've been dead for a while. It's the same concept that we've had already in several other of the anthology films, and it's just a bit tired at this point. But the main stories are all brilliant. There's a real consistency about this movie. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all the stories. I've already done a full review of this film, but I will pick out the two best out of the five. So one of them, I think it's called The Neat Job. It's about this woman who is getting bullied domestically by her husband, and she ends up turning the tables. Two brilliant acting performances. And the other story is the final one. It's about this guy who, because of some voodoo curse, he realises that if he paints a picture of someone and then the painting gets ruined, then the person who was in the painting dies wherever they are. Now, this is a brilliant story with a killer ending, and something that I've never forgotten is Denholm Elliott's brilliant attempt to not shoot himself. But there are other stories in this film that are extremely good as well. This film is probably better than you remember, because you might just hear the words Vault of Horror and remember the four blokes in the boring basement. But there's way more to this film than that. At number 6, we have From Beyond the Grave. It was very tight between this and Vault of Horror in 7th. I really had to think about that one. I actually think that Vault of Horror has the better main stories, but From Beyond the Grave has a better wraparound tale, and the overall movie just fits together better as an overall artistic piece of work, whereas Vault of Horror, lots of individual moments of brilliance that all feel kind of disjointed from each other. But From Beyond the Grave, there's this consistent message across the film that everybody who tries to rip off Cushing in the wraparound tale will then go on to have some really bad luck in their main story, except for the one guy who doesn't rip off Cushing, and he turns out to be the only person who survives his story. But yeah, Cushing in this antique shop is wonderful. I love his Yorkshire accent. I love how he's just messing with everybody who comes in, but they don't fully realise it. So again, if I had to pick out two main stories in this that I particularly like, it's difficult with From Beyond the Grave, because I think all four of the main stories are almost the same in quality, really, but I will rise to the challenge and pick two. So one would be where the guy has got an invisible imp on his shoulder and he gets Madame Orloff to do some kind of ritual to get rid of it. Now, I'm slightly surprised I'm actually picking that, because it's very much a comedy sort of episode, and I don't usually go in for comedy, but I just laugh so much when this ritual is happening and the house is just falling to bits because Orloff is being too sloppy with her work. And the other story I'll choose is the final one, The Door, I think it's called. I mean, it's not an amazing story, and I think I actually criticised some of the production design choices in it when I was doing my full review, but I think it was when I was watching this final story that I realised what the overall message of the film was, and I think I really liked that. It gave me a good feel-good factor, I think, when I was just going down the closing stretches of the movie. So From Beyond the Grave just about edges Vault of Horror into 6th place. Controversial, maybe, but it's not quite good enough to make it into my top 5. So at number 5, we have what is, in my opinion, the best ever non-anthology film that Amicus ever did, Madhouse. So yeah, after number 5 today, it's all anthology films for the rest of the way. But Madhouse was a real surprise to me, because I'd not even really heard of it before. It's a kind of giallo film where Vincent Price is in the lead role. He's playing an actor whose career is very much on the wobble because people keep dying around him, and he desperately needs to find out who is doing the killing. There's a bit more to the story than that, but I'm giving you the short version. But there's some great kills in this film, some really good setups, great locations. Peter Cushing's in it as well, although we don't quite get as much of him as I would have liked necessarily. But I've got very little to criticise about this film. It's a film that's right up my alley, and I could definitely see myself buying this in the future. When I watched it, I think I watched it on my phone. Maybe it was on YouTube or somewhere else that was really cheap or maybe even free. I can't recall now, but I could definitely see myself getting this one. I'm just surprised that it was so good, given the fact that I'd never heard of it before. So at number 4, we have Tales from the Crypt. This one has a bit of an iffy wraparound tale, albeit not the same levels of iffy seen in Vault of Horror, but it's in the main stories that this film scores its big points. And it's very easy this time for me to pick my 2 favourite stories, and that's not because the others are weak. It's because we have 2 here that are especially A+. And they're actually the first 2 stories in the film. So straight up we have Joan Collins trying to survive a killer trying to get into her house on Christmas Eve just after she's killed her husband, bizarrely. But as this ordeal is progressing, we can hear these Christmas carols playing on the radio, and I just love the feel of this story. It really gets the film off to a flyer. And then after that, we've got this story of a guy who's having an affair, and just as he's driving somewhere with his mistress, they have a crash, but when he comes out of the car, we're not sure if he's dead or alive, and the rest of the story kind of messes with your mind a little bit. You're not sure if what's going on is real or not. But I like stories like this, and there is one poor one, I'd say, that I don't like at all. So Peter Cushing is playing a character called Mr. Grimsdyke in A Tale of Revenge, but it's just very uninspired. But when you've got 5 main stories in a film like this, it doesn't matter if one of them is completely off kilter, and probably for a lot of people they actually like that story, I don't know. But overall, the film is absolute excellence for me, especially because of those first 2 knockout stories. Just to demonstrate to you how extra cool the top 3 films are in this ranking, I decided to tell you about those on a completely different filming day. Actually, that's a lie. I simply ran out of time yesterday after I'd talked about Madhouse. So here we are, back again to finish this thing off. Now, the top 3 do have a couple of things in common with each other. Firstly, they're all anthology films, and secondly, they all have excellent connecting stories, which is a very important thing for me in an anthology. Although in the case of our number 3, The House That Dripped Blood, it's not so much a story as simply a creepy house where different renters move in, have a horror experience of some sorts, and then they usually die, and then the next renter moves in, rinse repeat for 4 entire stories. The landlord probably makes a hell of a lot of money out of this movie, probably sat in Spain somewhere counting their coin. I think they must keep about 4 different rent deposits by the end of The House That Dripped Blood, but we never get to meet them, I don't think. Now, it's not easy to pick out 2 particular stories from this film because they're all excellent, but if I had to, I'd go for the Cushing one, where he ends up in a wax museum and he gets into all sorts of bother with the owner and an old friend who turns up, and the exhibits in the museum themselves. And I'd also pick the final story, which is a comedy of sorts about this actor who only plays the part of vampires usually. It's a bit of a send-up of the early career of Christopher Lee, but his life changes drastically when he gets this magic cloak from an antique store. That's one of the cool things about this film. It's not entirely confined to the creepy house. Some characters go out into the local township and have their stories play out there, which is a good move, I think. It just stops the movie feeling too restrictive. But this is a damn good film, and it gets my bronze medal today. Now, the top 2 today have something in common with each other that is independent from The House That Dripped Blood. So, when it comes to the 7 Amicus anthology films, 2 of them I discovered in the 90s, and the other 5 I didn't check out until I was in my 30s, and I started buying up the Blu-rays. And I don't think it's a complete coincidence that my top 2 films just happen to be those 2 films from the 90s. But there you go. When it comes to the number 1 today, I think that film would have won either way, but we'll get to that film. But at number 2, we have Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. I love the wraparound story in this. Dr. Shrek on the train with the 5 guys. I love this style of train. I love trains anyway. And it's so creepy how we go through each of these stories one by one, and we don't actually know when these men died. Did they die long before they got on the train, or was there a train crash and their day was reset somehow so they could then meet the Reaper back on the train? It's never fully explained, but I like that. It just leaves something to the imagination. And when it comes to the main stories, again, very difficult to pick out two. There's 5 stories this time. But if I had to choose 2, I'd go for the Roy Castle one in Jamaica, where he's stealing music from the locals. It's got one of my favourite horror comedy scenes of all time, when Castle is hiding in a bush, grinning at the music. And every time we cut back to him, there's like an extra tribesman stood behind him. It's so cheesy, but it works so well. And the other story I'd pick would be the Christopher Lee one with the creeping hand. Lee is absolutely superb in this story. I wouldn't have minded a full-length feature film just on this, actually. And the special effects of the hand are done very well, given the era that the film came out in. And I love how this overall movie finishes with the 5 guys realising what's going on, and then they walk towards the waiting room, and Donald Sutherland adjusts his tie for no good reason at all. But I like that. Some of the best stuff in this movie is just completely pointless stuff. But there we have it. So number 2, the house that sorry, not the house that dripped blood, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. But it's now time to move on and find out what is our number 1 movie. Yep, at number 1 we have Asylum, such a brilliant movie. For me, this is the yardstick by which all other horror anthologies should be judged. And this has the best wraparound story you will ever find in a movie like this. It's just so immersive. Watching Robert Powell go around this asylum, trying to figure out who Dr. Starr is. You can play along at home. Although, the last time that I watched this, I started to doubt that Max Reynolds is actually Dr. Starr. And I think I came up with 2 reasons for thinking that. Firstly, he comes across like a bit of a fantasist. And secondly, there was some kind of logistical reason as to why he couldn't be Dr. Starr, in my opinion. I think the person it's most likely to be is the woman from the story Lucy Comes to Stay. Though I can't remember the exact reason why I thought that, because it's been about 6 months since I last saw the movie now. But if you want to hear more about my theories as to who is and isn't Dr. Starr, then check out my full review on the movie, which is in my Amicus playlist. Now, in terms of picking out the best stories from this one, it's not easy. I've got to include the one with the parcels. That is just incredible. And also the one with Cushing, where he comes up with this magical coat that brings a mannequin to life. And I'd also like to include Lucy Comes to Stay. Weirdly, the only story in this film that I can remember the title for, but that's a really good one as well. Probably only the 4th story lags behind a bit, but that's not really a proper story in its own right. It's sort of the beginning of the end of the movie, kind of. But Asylum is amazing. I've probably seen it 7 or 8 times over the span of 30 years. And you know what? If I ever do a ranking just for horror anthologies in general, I've probably already given away what is going to be number 1 just because of how I've talked about Asylum here, but it's so good. So that brings us to the end of my ranking. Do let me know in the comments how you would rank the Amicus films that you have seen, and you get extra bonus points for including films that are not just the anthologies. But I will leave it there for today. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back again very soon. Bye-bye for now.